All right, it looks like we've got a good level of participation. Again, California Air Resources Board Cap and Trade Program Pre-Rulemaking Workshop. I'm Mark Cipolla. I'm the chief of the Cap and Trade Program in California. Welcome. I want to start just by letting you know that this meeting is being interpreted into Spanish. To access the interpretation services, click the globe icon at the bottom of your window and select Spanish. To hear only Spanish interpretation and not the original audio, select Mute Original Audio in the interpretation menu. Select English in the interpretation menu to hear simultaneous English interpretation of any comments in Spanish. If you are listening in English, do not select Mute Original Audio. Our interpreters today are Ruth and Carlos. I will now have Carlos give these instructions in Spanish to the entire audience before he moves to the Spanish audio channel. The globe icon for the Spanish audio channel will appear after Carlos completes these instructions. Carlos?
Thank you very much, Mark. We'll now begin with those instructions in Spanish. Buenas tardes. Se está ofreciendo interpretación simultánea para este taller. Para hacer uso del servicio justo después de este anuncio, en la barra de controles de Zoom, por lo general en la parte inferior de la pantalla, aparecerá un icono de interpretación, parece un globito terráqueo como ven en pantalla. Simplemente le da clic y selecciona español como su idioma. Si por algún motivo no ve el icono, seleccione primero los puntos suspensivos, luego español y luego su idioma. Si quiere escuchar solo la interpretación y no el lenguaje original al mismo tiempo, seleccione silenciar audio original o mute original audio. Gracias and thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Carlos. Again, Mark Cipolla, Chief of CARB's Cap and Trade Program. I'm joined on the panel today by Rajinder Sahota, CARB's Deputy Executive Officer for Climate Change and Research. Also joined by our counterparts in Quebec, Jean-Yves Benoit. He's the Director General at the Ministry of the Environment and the Fight Against Climate Change in Quebec. Quebec is, of course, our linkage partner for over a decade in the Cap and Trade Program. So this workshop will focus on potential updates to annual allowance budgets. We have a staff presentation that'll last around 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session after that. This is just the next in a series of workshops that began last summer to discuss the Cap and Trade Program updates in the context of the most recent scoping plan and our most recent legislative climate targets. Our goal here is to wind down this pre-rulemaking phase soon. We're looking to release a proposal by late summer. And after that, our goal will be to get the proposed amendments adopted and in effect in early 2025. Given that we do not expect the new regulation to be in place in time for allocation of the vintage 2025 allowances in October of this year, we're not including any changes to the 2025 allowance budgets in the discussion today. With that preface, I would like to invite Michael Turgeon. He's CARB staff, and he will provide today's staff presentation. Michael.
Thank you, Mark. A few more workshop logistics before we get started. This workshop is being recorded and will be posted on the Cap and Trade Meetings and Workshops webpage, where you can find material for today's workshop and a link to CARB's public comment docket. The deadline to submit written feedback is July 31st, 2024. Okay, today staff will present a brief overview of context for the Cap and Trade Program updates. Then staff will review development of allowance budgets presented at previous workshops and incorporated into the SRIA scenarios, and then move to a discussion of budget options for a smooth transition to a post-2030 program. The staff presentation will be followed by a public comment period. Okay, we'll now provide a brief overview of the potential changes to the Cap and Trade Program. At the highest level, California's climate policies, like Cap and Trade, are determined by state legislation and executive orders. These statutes and directives establish both statewide GHG targets or sector-specific goals, which inform CARB's climate change scoping plan and individual policies and regulations. Since the adoption of the first scoping plan in 2008, carbon pricing in the form of a cap-and-trade program has been part of California's successful portfolio approach to achieving the state's GHG emissions reduction targets, and it will remain critical as we work toward economy-wide decarbonization. The process to update the program is being informed by AB 1279, which established the state goals of reducing anthropogenic GHG emissions by 85% below 1990 levels and achieving carbon neutrality by 2045. Also, the 2022 scoping plan update, which indicated the need to increase 2030 emissions reductions from the SB 32 target to support achievement of 2045 climate targets. Also, an updated AB 32 GHG emission inventory. The inventory published in 2022 included an adjustment to align emissions from all sectors with third-party verified data. And finally, staff are continuing to assess updates based on implementation needs and ongoing experience. CARB held 6 workshops and 2 community meetings in 2023 and 2024 to develop concepts aligned with state goals. Over the past year, informed by engagement with stakeholders and the public through the pre-rulemaking process, staff have developed initial concepts for potential updates focusing on increasing program stringency and supporting a long-term carbon price signal aligned with the state's 2045 climate targets. Review of market rules and cost containment features in the context of allowance budget adjustments to support liquidity, enhance market protections, and ensure transparent pricing. Account for evolution of the electricity sector in the Western US. Updates to minimize emissions leakage and continue to support decarbonization and innovation in California's industrial sector and fuel sector, and updates to offset credit provisions and protocols to streamline implementation and reflect best available science. Staff emphasized that CARB must review potential updates to program provisions in the context of the overall program and not in isolation. Cumulative impacts are evaluated in the context of overall program stability and the need for a steadily increasing price signal. Now I will present an overview of the development of potential program budgets as discussed in public workshops to date. Total allowance budgets through 2020 were established in the 2010 rulemaking, and budgets through 2030 were established in the 2016 rulemaking. Early year allowance budgets were established using the best available data to estimate the emissions for the year that a covered source category entered the program. The annual budgets were then set to decline linearly to the 2020 allowance budget, which is 334.2 million allowances, as calculated as the 2020 target multiplied by 77.5%, which is the percentage of emissions from the statewide GHG emissions inventory estimated to be covered by the program. In the 2016 rulemaking, annual 2021 through 2030 allowance budgets were set to decline linearly from the established 2020 allowance budget to a 2030 allowance budget that reflects the statewide SB 32 GHG reduction target, which is a 40% reduction relative to 1990 levels. The 2030 allowance budget was calculated as 77.5% of the 2030 SB 32 target, utilizing the percentage of statewide emissions previously projected to be covered by the program in 2020. Throughout 2023 and 2024, staff have evaluated a range of allowance budget scenarios through 2030 and the post-2030 program. The process to develop potential budgets builds upon budget evaluations in the 2010 and 2016 rulemakings. This slide illustrates the initial framework that staff used to develop budget scenarios through 2030. As presented in the July 2023 workshop, staff evaluated hypothetical 2021 through 2030 allowance budgets to determine the cumulative allowance removals needed to achieve the state climate targets. Staff then used the calculated number of cumulative allowance removals to construct potential updated 2025 through 2030 program budgets. As detailed in the July 2023 workshop, the 2021 starting point used in these cumulative analyses reflects a downward adjustment of emissions projected by the 2017 scoping plan update, consistent with recent updates to the GHG emission inventory. This approach reflects the projection of 2020 emissions that could have been used to establish the 2021 through 2030 annual budgets during the 2016 rulemaking, had the GHG emission inventory at the time reflected recent data and method updates. Emissions in recent versions of the GHG inventory are on average lower than the 2017 edition by 13.7 million metric tons of CO2e for data years 2012 through 2015, the last 4 data years in the 2017 edition of the inventory. The downward adjustment of the 2021 starting point by 13.7 million MTCO2e is made to account for a more accurate calculation of emissions from 2012 through 2015, which impacted the 2017 scoping plan and 2016 cap and trade rulemaking. After determining the 2021 start point, staff calculated the 2030 allowance budget endpoints to reflect the emissions reduction targets from 1990 levels by 2030 of either 40, 48, or 55% below 1990 levels in 2030. Staff calculated a linear annual decline from the hypothetical 2021 start point to the 2030 endpoint associated with the GHG reduction target for each scenario. This hypothetical linear decline from 2021 to 2030 was used to determine the cumulative number of allowance removals needed to support 2030 state climate targets. These cumulative analyses indicate the need to remove approximately 115 million allowances from program budgets through 2030 to account for prior year AB 32 GHG emission inventory adjustments, and that further downward adjustments are needed to support increased ambition beyond the 40% reduction target for 2030. Approximately 265 million allowances would need to be removed from 2021 to 2030 program budgets to support the 48% reduction target by 2030. For each scenario, the cap and trade program was calculated to cover 77% of AB 32 GHG emission sources for 2021 through 2030 based on recent covered emissions, GHG inventory data, and 2022 scoping plan modeling. Staff also examined post-2030 budgets that declined linearly from a 2030 value consistent with the emissions reduction target for the scenario to a 2045 allowance budget consistent with a statewide 2045 85% GHG reduction target. This process aligns with the methods for calculating 2013 through 2020 annual budgets in the 2010 rulemaking and for calculating 2021 through 2030 budgets in the 2016 rulemaking. The 2045 allowance budget target was calculated by using the 2022 scoping plan scenario modeling estimate of 2045 covered sector or broad scope emissions multiplied by the ratio of 2021 covered emissions from MRR over the 2021 covered sector emissions from the 2022 scoping plan scenario. This method is consistent with the method for calculating the 2020 cap and the initial 2010 rulemaking. With this framework, a 2045 allowance budget consistent with the statewide 85% GHG reduction target for 2045 is 30.3 million allowances. The calculated 2045 allowance budget is 47% of the 2045 statewide legislative target from AB 1279, resulting from an increasing share of non-covered sources in AB 32 emissions. Establishment of budgets through 2045 provides a long-term policy signal, but budgets may be subject to future adjustments in future rulemakings. This slide summarizes cumulative allowance budgets and reductions for allowance budget scenarios discussed in the pre-rulemaking workshops to date. These scenarios reflect GHG inventory updates and are consistent with GHG emissions reduction targets of either 40, 48, or 55% below 1990 levels in 2030. Consistent with the 2022 scoping plan, the Standardized Regulatory Impact Assessment, or SRIA, assessed proposed scenario allowance budgets aligned with the 48% by 2030 target. For the 48% scenario, the cumulative reductions through 2030 are approximately 265 million allowances, and the total 2021 through 2045 cumulative budget is approximately 3,795 million allowances. CARB released the SRIA on April 9th. The SRIA represents an initial economic evaluation of potential changes to the program and is prepared using the best information available, but may not reflect precise real-world potential impacts. CARB emphasizes the SRIA is not a staff proposal for amendments, but is one of many steps CARB must take prior to updating the regulation. The table on the right shows the estimated GHG and criteria pollutant emission reductions achieved for each scenario. The SRIA examined 3 proposed scenarios aligned with the 48% GHG reduction target for 2030 and 2 alternative scenarios aligned with the 40% and 55% GHG reduction targets, respectively. This slide illustrates how the SRIA proposed scenario A achieved the cumulative allowance budget removals needed for the 48% GHG reduction scenario with annual budgets that could be adopted into the regulation. The blue line on the chart represents the current allowance budgets adopted in the cap and trade regulation. In the SRIA proposed scenario A, the entire 2021 to 2030 cumulative reduction of 265 million allowances is achieved by removing allowances from the 2025 through 2030 budget years. Then the post-2030 budgets decline linearly from a 2030 value that is consistent with the 2030 emissions reduction target of 173 million metric tons CO2e. This framework results in a significant increase in annual budgets from 2030 to 2031, and annual budgets remain higher than 2030 through 2033. Under SRIA proposed scenario A, the increase in annual budgets from 2030 to 2031 could result in a potential discontinuity in cap adjustment factors and allowance allocation, holding limits, and auction proceeds to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, or GGRF. In response to our April 2024 workshop, a variety of market participants and market observers noted that this discontinuity could increase the risk of price volatility and uncertainty for covered entities. Commenters suggested the discontinuity in the SRIA proposed scenarios could be addressed by a variety of alternative smoothed scenarios. Staff seek to achieve cumulative allowance budgets and GHG reductions for the potential 48% scenario while providing consistent treatment of covered entities and promoting a steady and well-functioning market. To decrease the potential for market disruptions, staff are now exploring options to enable a transition into the post-2030 program following a smooth annual budget trajectory. One simple method to achieve a smooth transition would be to linearly decline 2025 through 2030 annual allowance budgets to reach a 173 million allowance budget in 2030, which is aligned with the 48% GHG reduction target. Then post-2030 budgets would be set to decline linearly to 30.3 million allowances in 2045, which is aligned with the 85% target. This illustrative budget scenario is represented by the solid gray line on the chart and denoted as 48% simple. While the simple method calculates annual budgets in the years 2030 and 2045 directly from emissions reduction targets, it only removes 98 million allowances through 2030 from existing budgets, as shown by the gray row at the bottom of the table. While the 2030 endpoint for the simple scenario is derived from the 2030 target, the cumulative number of allowance removals through 2030 is lower than any scenario examined in the SORIA. Staff conclude the cumulative program budget using the 48% simple target method is not supportive of achievement of the state's 2045 target set by AB 1279. Staff analysis indicates that removal of a minimum of 115 million allowances from budgets through 2030 is needed to account for AB 32 GHG emission inventory adjustments, and that further downward adjustments are needed to support increased ambition for 2030 beyond the 40% target. In developing annual allowance budgets, staff must balance considerations for program updates. These considerations include supporting state climate targets, considering cost effectiveness, economy-wide costs, and technological feasibility, enabling a smooth transition to the post-2030 program, minimizing the risk of emissions leakage, maintaining cost containment mechanisms and protecting against price volatility, and avoiding disproportionate impacts on low-income communities. Many of these considerations are also legislative directives from AB 32 and AB 398, and any proposal to adjust budgets must also be implementable given rulemaking timelines. CARB has determined that the adjusted timeline to complete the rulemaking by early 2025 means vintage 2026 is the earliest budget year available for cap adjustments and other potential updates to the program. Given these considerations, staff have developed two potential smoothed scenario options that are consistent with the 48% target cumulative budgets. Each of these options, illustrated in red lines in the figure, achieves cumulative 2021 through 2045 allowance budgets aligned with the 48% GHG reduction scenario, incents increased decarbonization investments this decade, avoids discontinuities in cap adjustment factors, allocation, holding limits, and funds to GGRF, maintains all current allowances in cost containment accounts, and adjustments start for budget year 2026. For the smooth scenario option 1, the solid red line, 180 million allowances in total are removed from 2026 through 2030 annual budgets, and post-2030 budgets then linearly decline to the 2045 target. Moderation of near-term removals helps limit short-term impacts to the economy, consumers, and ratepayers, and it's least disruptive to regulated entity financial planning. For option 2, the dotted red line, 265 million allowances in total are removed from the 2026 through 2030 annual budgets, and post-2030 budgets remain at the 2030 budget level through 2036 and then decrease to meet the 2045 target. Option 1, Option 2, and SORIA proposed scenario A all have the same cumulative allowance budgets through 2045 as needed to achieve the state's climate goals. However, each of these scenarios follows a different path in the interim years and reflects a different balance of program considerations. This slide shows potential cap adjustment factors associated with the two smoothed allowance budget options consistent with the 48% cumulative reduction scenario. For the 2026 through 2030 period, Option 1 and Option 2 have annual average reductions in cap adjustment factors of 10% and 14% respectively. For both scenarios, all the removals for budget years 2026 through 2030 are from the auction and allocation accounts. To summarize, CARB staff developed new cumulative allowance budgets through 2045 that support state climate targets and reflect concurrent program goals such as minimizing price volatility, emissions leakage, and impacts on low-income communities. To achieve these goals, given rulemaking timelines, new allowance budgets will need to begin in 2026, and some budget smoothing will be needed for the transition to a post-2030 program. The examples shown here are illustrative, and there may be other feasible approaches. CARB requests feedback on support or concerns with option 1 and 2. CARB also requests stakeholder input on how CARB should prioritize a need for a smooth transition from 2030 to 2031. As shown in the previous slides, CARB has proposed 2 potential implementation options if the regulation is in effect in 2025. Option 1 removes 180 million allowances from 2026 through 2030. This moderation of near-term removals through 2030 is balanced by lower budgets through the 2030s. From 2026 through 2030, the average annual cap decline is 10%, reaching a cap adjustment factor of 0.409 in 2030. This decline in caps is less steep through 2030 than SRIA proposed scenario A. Option 2 removes 265 million allowances from 2026 through 2030. This option achieves the same removal through 2030 as SRIA proposed scenario A in 1 fewer year. From 2026 through 2030, the average annual cap decline is 14%, reaching a cap adjustment factor of 0.322 in 2030. Due to removing the same number of allowances in 1 fewer year, this option has a steeper decline through 2030 than SRIA proposed scenario A. Option 1, Option 2, and SRIA proposed scenario A all have the same cumulative allowance budgets through 2045. CARB aims to achieve regulatory certainty as soon as possible. Regulatory certainty will inform planning by regulated entities for a more stringent 2030 target and inform planning to leverage recent federal incentives. CARB anticipates releasing an initial rulemaking package with proposed allowance budgets and other program updates by late summer. Board consideration may occur by late 2024 to early 2025, with the goal of having the amended regulation in effect by early 2025. There will be multiple opportunities for public input after the rulemaking package has been released, including a 45-day public comment period. Okay, we will now open up the workshop for public comment. If you'd like to share feedback or ask questions, please use the raise hand function, which should be located on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window as shown. When staff calls your name and activates your audio controls, please click the unmute button, proceed to introduce yourself, and provide your comment. To accommodate as many people as we can, comments today are limited to 2 minutes, and there is no ceding time to others. Please reference the timer on the top right side of the slide for time remaining. Stakeholders will also be able to submit written feedback online until July 31st at 11:59 Pacific time. You can find a link to submit feedback as well as all relevant documents on our Cap and Trade meetings and workshops page. And with that, I will now pass the mic to my colleague, Cypress Figueroa, who will be facilitating the public comment session this afternoon. Cypress.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today during the public comment session. We have 2 hands raised. Looks like we will first hear from Clayton Munnings. Clayton, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the detailed slides and for the very clear presentation. Since the presentation was clear, I'll just ask 2 questions for the avoidance of doubt. One on option 1 and the other on option 2. So for option 1, this option would remove 180 million allowances, which does fall short of the initial targeted removal of 265 million allowances from 2021 to 2030. So my question is whether CARB intends to remove additional allowances beyond the 180 million already identified in option 1, for example, by removing further allowances from the APCR, price ceiling, or any other source. And then turning to option 2, do all the removals under option 2 come from auctioned or allocated pools? Again, just asking these questions to avoid any doubt. Thank you for the opportunity to comment.
Hi there. Thanks, Clayton, for that question. So for the first one, for option 1, which is 180 million, that is all, like you said, from the auction allocation account. And we could remove more for that 265 from the APCR tiers and the price ceiling, but we're mindful of the fact that those cost containment tiers are there for a purpose and a reason, which is to make sure that you're having some kind of mechanism to blunt price spikes in the program. Removing allowances from those tiers would push us to the ceiling faster if we ended up in that kind of a situation. And so we're carefully considering whether or not we should remove any additional allowances from those tiers. Just looking at that 180 versus the 265 million, the 180 from the auction allocation account is already close to 70% of that 265 million that we've been talking about initially. But what's really critical here is that the overall budget between now and 2045 is the same across both of those options. And then you're right on the option 2, all of that comes from the auction allocation piece.
Thank you. We will now hear from Mikhail Skavarla. Mikhail, you may unmute yourself and begin. Oh, looks like we lost you. We will hear next from Rupin Aslanian. Rupin, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, thank you for the time. I have 2 questions regarding the fear of discontinuance in certain aspects of the program. So the first one is, will the current offset credit provisions change to accommodate the reduction in allowances? And the second question being the holding limitations, as they are a function of the current annual cap, will there be revisions to the current framework or considerations in the future? Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the questions, Rupin. First, I think I heard you ask about updates to offset credit provisions. We don't have any proposal or related to changes to offset credit usage limit related to changes in the allowance budgets. Secondly, I think I heard your question, I cut out a little bit on me, but it was related to holding limits, I believe. And right now we do have a holding limit equation in the regulation. Changes, it's based on the allowance budget. So each year with the change in an allowance budget, the holding limit changes automatically based on that equation. That's the existing equation that we have, and that would be applied to any changes to these budgets to calculate holding limits. Does that address what you were asking? I'm not sure if you got unmuted, but
I think it does, Mark. I think it does address both the questions.
Thank you. We're going to move on to Gracina Mohabir. Gracina, you may unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is Christina Mohabir with California Environmental Voters. First, just want to thank staff for their work on this topic and for putting forth pertinent areas of improvements to the program in today's workshop. We know that cap and trade is a prominent tool in the state's strategy to meet our climate goals, and we think improving the function of this program further is really crucial as we hone in on these targets. As such, EnviroVoters is strongly supportive of a program that prioritizes ambitious and equitable emissions reductions. Just wanted to share support for proposed scenario A. We think it's great, and believe the strategy would encourage significant reductions from regulated entities. We'd also encourage CARB to review and pare down free allowances where possible as another mechanism of helping us meet these climate goals. And lastly, we'd like to encourage CARB staff to consider implementation of facility level caps as a means of protecting communities located near polluting facilities. The survey indicated that a substantial number of covered facilities are sited near disadvantaged communities. Facility level caps are something that we think could help prevent the program from exacerbating pollution hotspots. And yeah, thank you so much. And we look forward to continuing conversations with staff on this issue.
Thanks, Christina. It's great that you're also plugging into the cap and trade side. I know we've had some discussions on LCFS. Appreciate the support on this. Just on the free allocation, I think a thing that's worth noting is that the free allocation to the majority of the entities that get it is tied to the cap adjustment factor, which is how much the cap is declining over time. And that's why staff is calling out that 10% versus 14% on one of the slides. Currently, the average cap decline is 4%. So there is also a built-in mechanism that impacts what goes to free allocation for most of the entities in the program, tied to a more stringent decline year over year. On the facility caps, we do not believe that those are consistent with the direction in AB 398. We understand the concerns on local pollution, and we share those concerns, and so did the legislature when it enacted AB 617. We're always going to look for ways to try and reduce emissions and more directly actually reduce combustion of fossil fuels. It's that combustion of fossil fuels that provides both GHGs and air pollution, and so that is our focus. That was the focus of the scoping plan. It's going to take some time, and there's some transition here, and we're going to have to balance a myriad of direction in statute, which is achieving the targets, minimizing for leakage, cost-effective and technologically feasible, and make sure we don't exacerbate the disparities in air pollution for our already overly burdened communities. And I think looking at all of the data and all of the information out there, when you try and isolate the impacts of the cap and trade program, it's hard to isolate the impacts of any specific program, just like it's hard to isolate any impacts of the LCFS program. What we do believe is that implementation of this program is not exacerbating air pollution impacts. And in fact, what we believe needs to happen is a more focused review and process to look at permitting and those other air emissions for facilities in the communities. The other thing I'd like to note is that the large stationary sources are significant sources of criteria pollutants. But when you live in a community, you also get exposed to other toxics and other pollution from sources that don't even get regulated under cap and trade. And so I think we have to be mindful of what an individual community member feels versus what is happening at an individual facility. There's relationships there, but the exposure that I would feel leaving my house in one of these communities is going to be affected by all the sources in the region and all of the different types of pollution in the region. And so we need to think about it a bit more holistically as we do in AB 617. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go back to Mikhail Skvarla. Mikhail, you can unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Hi, thank you. Mikhail Skvarla here on behalf of the California Council for Environmental Balance. Appreciate the workshop and appreciate the slides coming out yesterday, so we had a chance to look at them. The additional two options, I think, are going to help our ability to analyze potential impacts and mitigate some prior concerns with the SRIA scenario. So I appreciate that putting out there. To that end, We do want to recognize where the removals will come from, and with the cap adjustment factors, it looks like a substantial increase in year-over-year reductions in allocations. And so to the extent that we can have additional conversations around where removals will take place and how those may impact facilities and electric utilities and their transition to decarbonized energy and adoption of clean energy technologies, those come with significant economic burdens on top of the cost of compliance for cap and trade. And so to the extent that we can balance those things in subsequent conversations, with where removals could come from, we'd appreciate the ability to have that opportunity. And again, I want to thank you guys for this conversation.
Thanks for the input, Mick. And we certainly do expect these conversations to continue up through and beyond the point when we put a proposal out. As you know, we are looking at a world in the future with a more stringent program. That means less allowances to go around. That means, less for utility ratepayer protection. That means less for auction and allocation. That means less for the industrial facilities to mitigate leakage. We see those as all important aspects of the program and important uses of the allowances. With less allowances available, there needs to be some belt tightening all around. But we definitely do hear the concerns about industrial leakage and the importance of the industrial sector to the California economy. So we are tuned into those, and we'll be happy to continue conversations about the most appropriate uses of the allowance allocation as we move forward. As things are, the cap adjustment factors do decline in proportion to any existing decreases in the overall budgets. What that means is that the way that the allowances are spread around is consistent with the history of the program. Each
Did I lose you, Mark?
Yeah,
I
it sounds
think-
like Mark is having some
Okay.
difficulties.
Yeah.
I think we can appreciate the history and where the program's going and continue to support working this out. And I think it just may require additional conversations around the utilization of revenue and how we balance these things is all very critically important. And we know that CARB's working diligently to get there, and we'll continue to work collaboratively.
Yeah, Mick, and I think you said the operative work there, which is a balance. We're balancing across multiple priorities and directions in statute and interests here to make sure that we do this in a way that doesn't have huge economic or consumer impacts while still hitting the targets. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now hear from Stephen Rosenblum. Stephen, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, my name is Stephen Rosenblum. I'm with Climate Action California, and I'd like to compliment you on pursuing the 48% option seriously. I think it's an improvement over the 40% reduction. I'm concerned that you seem to have abandoned the 55% possibility. California mainly serves as an example to the world of having only a few percent of the GHG emissions while having this 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. What we do to reduce our emissions has a minuscule effect on global warming, but as an example to the world, it has a huge effect that we're able to do it and maintain a thriving economy at the same time, which belies all the arguments raised by the fossil fuel industry that we're killing the economy by eliminating carbon dioxide emissions. I wanted to raise a somewhat unrelated question that's brought up in slide 20 that was given in the program that shows the reductions in NOx and PM 2.5 associated with each program. This is related to a comment that was made by previous speaker here and responded to in part by Rajendra Sahota. But CARB has an obligation in other areas, as Rajendra mentioned, to reduce these noxious pollutants. And they have a huge cost to California, both in hospitalizations and deaths, and as well as diseases like heart disease, premature birth, breathing difficulties. So there is a significant economic effect associated with that. And I don't see, unfortunately, any way that cap and trade factors this into its economic modeling. It seems to be only associated with the effect on industry and other such things. So thank you. I appreciate an answer to that.
Thank you for that question. And I want to take the 55 first, and then we'll talk about the health and economic analyses here. So we get our authority from and direction from the legislature and what's already been signed into law. What's in law right now is a 40%. What our scoping plan showed was a 48%, and that was the administration scoping plan trying to tie us to a path for the next target in 2045. So right now, the minimum is the 40%, which is in statute. We're trying to hit a 48% because that would put us on track to hit the target in 2045. The balance, again, that we have to do is to make sure that we don't have leakage, that we don't have huge consumer impacts or impacts to energy prices, and keep affordability in mind. We know that with increasing energy prices and inflation, there is a lot of concern over additional costs that would be put into the economy. What people often forget are the other costs looming out there for house insurance or wildfire insurance or health insurance that can be tied to climate change impacts. So all of this has to be considered together. And so when we talk about the cap and trade program itself and what it factors in, it is tied to GHG emissions. But when we do the full initial statement of reasons, we do look at the economic benefits of avoided hospitalizations, respiratory disease, missed days of school, missed days of work, all of that in that initial statement of reasons. I think it's always good to remember the cap and trade program is not the only program that is tied to getting us to any target, nor is it the only program to address air quality emissions. There is an entire process at CARB, almost 40 plus years worth of work on traditional air pollution, the federal standards and state standards for things like NOx. And that SIP and that process are the main place that we look to for guidance on what goes into a scoping plan. So if the SIP says to meet our targets for NOx or some other criteria pollutants or other harmful local pollution, we need to meet certain targets for transportation or for stationary sources or for energy, then those become part of the scoping plan. Those are subsumed into the scoping plan itself to make sure that the scoping plan supports and further uplifts the types of actions that the SIP is identifying. And so I want to make sure that there isn't this impression that we do this in a vacuum or in isolation. That's not true. The cap and trade program is part of that overall strategy that's designed through the scoping plan process. And that's where air quality and climate change are all pulled together to make sure we're all rowing in the same direction. And as part of the detailed work on the initial statement of reasons for the cap and trade regulation, we absolutely take into account all of those other air pollutants and harms that they can do to residents and communities and throughout the state of California. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now hear from Christopher Chavez. Christopher, you may unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Yes, good afternoon. Chris Chavez with Coalition for Clean Air. Just really quickly wanted to echo the comments of Gracinia about the need to reduce localized air pollutants. I know you haven't been involved with the AB 617 process, that there is a lot that can be done even further to reduce those air pollutants that are affecting the health and well-being of the people living in these communities. My question is about it's kind of a double-sided question. both somewhat related. I think you may have touched upon some of it, so maybe a little bit additional detail would be helpful. In either of the scenarios being considered, are there any impacts or anticipated impacts to potential reductions in criteria air pollutants and toxic air contaminants in the changes associated with the change, with the adjustments to the markets being considered? Likewise, are there any changes anticipated in terms of the revenues going into the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund? As we know, the budget just wrapped up, and I think that the agreement between the legislature and the governor programs a lot of money out into the future through the GGRF. So are there any anticipated impacts to that fund as well?
Hi, Christopher. Thanks for the comments and questions. Related to air quality impacts, I do believe there was a fairly thorough assessment in the standardized regulatory impact assessment, the economic assessment that was released on April 9th. So I would encourage you to consult that for both some initial air quality assessments and GGRF assessments related to the scenarios that were assessed there. There can be relationships between local air pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions. We do expect, with greater stringency and increased reduction of greenhouse gas and the move towards cleaner fuels and away from fossil burning fuels, that there will come air quality improvements, but there's often not a direct one-to-one relationship there. I believe that there was recent conversations likely about, just on this call, about the local permitting process and work at CARB to strengthen that process and to involve communities in decisions about monitoring and addressing local air pollution. So we do have those and can continue to work to strengthen those.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I can also take the GGRF question. So we're taking out supply of allowances, and that means that there'll be less going to auctions, less going to allocation, less going overall to everyone, as Mark had indicated earlier. When you decrease that supply, depending on demand, prices will move up from the floor. Right now, I think they're sitting at about $35, and the floor is about $26, $27. How much more those prices move is unknown. So we can't make a prediction about what this means for revenues to the GGRF. What we will know is how many allowances can go to GGRF. And when we think about the demand is predicated on complementary policies and opportunities to actually reduce emissions. For example, if we don't get our waivers for the transportation sector, that means cap and trade has to do more to help with the reductions there, which means more competition for those, or demand for those allowances. If we can't permit and build things like clean energy infrastructure for hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, or we can't build and put an infrastructure for things like carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, then that means demand remains high, unless you're willing to dial back the production at some of these facilities and maybe risk leakage. So it's a very complex question to answer, because that demand for allowances is predicated on the performance of several other complementary regulations and the opportunities that are available for industries to be able to decarbonize, and the pathways that will be available there. Thank you for that question. I think lots of people have that question who are very involved in the budgeting process on GGRF. So it's unknown at this time. And as the market administrator, we actually don't predict prices for the market either, because we have access to a lot of information behind the scenes. And so we try to not to put our influence into the market and let the market resolve for itself what that balance is for a carbon price based on the demand and supply that's already out there and publicly known. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now hear from Andre Templeman. Andre, you may unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Hi, Rajinder. This is, I guess, specific to your last comment, potentially. In one of the workshops, probably almost a year ago now, you had mentioned a discussion on potentially revisiting the floors and APCR levels and maybe even the ceiling. Is that, I haven't heard anything about that since, and just kind of wondering if, as we tighten supply, those price levels are also being reconsidered.
Hi, Andre. Yes, we haven't had a workshop on that because we're still working through what we think the supply should look like. And we're working towards that proposal for the 45-day. At this time, I don't have anything to share, and neither do the staff, on any changes to the price ceiling or the price tiers. We're still looking at those, though.
Thank you. We will now hear from Nicholas Roy. Nicholas, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, my name is Nick Roy. I'm a research associate at Resources for the Future. We're a nonpartisan environmental economics think tank in Washington, D.C. I just want to commend CARB today for their serious consideration of the value of the APCR allowances. Preserving those is a decision to also preserve revenues, emissions reductions, and price stability in comparison to higher emissions for lower incentives for decarbonization that could materialize if they were to remove the APCR. And that's what we would see with the SRIA option B and C scenarios. After the last workshop, we had submitted comments about this particular issue, as well as many others, in our report, Designing for Uncertainty. Includes analysis of the APCR as well as other different balances of program considerations, as CARB has described them today. Some of those considerations include the facilities fit caps, which another commenter mentioned, the 55% scenario, another commenter mentioned, as well as an emissions containment reserve, which no one has mentioned so far today. We want to highlight that the special contribution of the carbon market is its capacity to respond to the fundamental uncertainty of emissions and market outcomes that Rajinder was alluding to earlier. And that, of course, is related to the evolution of technology and changes in the economy, which nobody can predict. So we encourage CARB to continue consideration of other design elements, such as those that other commenters have talked about today, that promote a more resilient carbon market in line with the state's climate, economic, and justice goals. I also have a few questions. The first is, does the cap adjustment factor apply uniformly to both the pool of auctioned and freely allocated allowances? And the other is CARB doing any consideration of an ECR in its coming workshops? And finally, what's the status of CARB's collaboration with Washington's Department of Ecology as they move towards linking their carbon markets? Thank you for this workshop, and really appreciate all the work staff has put in it today. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Nicholas. Quick responses to those final short questions. Cap adjustment factors relate only to allowance allocation. However, they do generally are exactly proportional to the declines in the overall allowance budgets. So those are essentially the same for almost all allowance allocation. We have received input on an emissions containment reserve. I'll note that the program does have an existing mechanism to adjust for unsold allowances in times when prices are low. That mechanism's come into play in the past, where around 37 million allowances were removed from circulation in the 2016-2017 timeframe when there was some regulatory uncertainty. So there is a mechanism there to address that very situation that the ECR would also address. And then related to Washington, we did have an announcement back in March of this year about an intention to pursue linkage discussions with Washington. We're aware and in discussions with them. This rulemaking is not addressing any potential linkage with the Cap and Invest program in Washington. So linkage is a process for California That requires a formal rulemaking process. It requires some additional work, including a linkage report and linkage findings by our governor related to Senate Bill 1018 and the stringency of the program, the enforceability of the program, and liability to the state. So it is not something that is imminent. It would require substantial process before happening.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I'll just follow up on the Washington piece. I don't have anything to add to the other pieces. I thought that was a great response. First of all, we're very excited that Washington was able to get some recent legislation to make some adjustments to where we could start to more intentionally pursue linkage discussions. That's great. And we know that they have a ballot measure, and we think that everything should be done to support them making it through that ballot measure and being able to persist and continue to administer their programs, both the Clean Fuels and their Cap and Invest program. It would be a shame to see backsliding on climate ambition in some of the more progressive, forward-leaning states. And so we want to make sure that you all know that we support them and want to see them be successful and make it through that ballot measure. Part of that is also us working with them even during our own rulemaking process here. So Quebec and California are keeping our colleagues in Washington updated on things that we're thinking and considering and the workshops that we're having. I will note that we recognize there is a workshop in Washington today at this very same time on linkage, and that they did put out a blog related to an update on linkage this week. And so I really just want to take the time to say, we want them to be successful and we need them to be successful because we need many more states to come up and be in the place to be able to implement these programs and push on reductions in greenhouse gases. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now hear from Xavier Zame. Xavier, you may unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I just had a couple of questions actually. The first was just around the new timeline. How confident are you in the new timeline and getting a rulemaking done by early 2025? And why couldn't removals begin in the second half of 2025 if the rulemaking is complete in early 2025? And then my second question is just whether or not ARB is leaning towards option 1 or option 2 and why.
Thanks, Xavier, for the questions. Regarding timeline, we've put that out there. We have the intention to follow through on that. Things come up, but we, are always at the staff level working tirelessly to get everything done on our timelines. For changes in 2025, we do, the first time we touch allowances typically in any given budget year is with the allowance allocations that happen to the utilities and to the industrial sources for leakage, utilities for ratepayer protection. That happens by October of the year preceding. So that'll be October of 2024 when we distribute many of the allowances from the 2025 budget. Those, the current regulation is structured with current budgets and current cap adjustment factors. So those cap adjustment factors would apply. That's not to say that they're, those are final, but that is like, those are the, once we put those out, that is kind of what the budgets are, and it gets complicated to make changes to that budget after those allocations have happened. And sorry, your second question.
I think it was options, like which options?
We have options. We're really looking for input on approaches. So
yeah, and I will flag that, at 265 million, one of the options in the Syria was 50% from the auction allocation pot and the rest from the price tiers and the price ceiling. Option 1 is 180 million from the auction allocation fund, and that is almost 70% of that 265 million. What we really care about is, one, managing for leakage risk for industry that might be facing a 10 versus a 14%, when the current cap decline for free allocation is about 4 to 5% for this decade in the existing regulation. And then also thinking about cost containment, making the program more stringent and pulling out more allowances from those cost containment tiers isn't going to be a helpful solution if we have price spikes and those become cautionary tales to other jurisdictions looking at these programs. And so as we're mindful about the targets and what we need to do for California, we're also mindful about how others are watching the experiences that we have and other like-minded states have as they consider taking on similar types of programs. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'll just reiterate a point that I think was made multiple times throughout the presentation, that there was the SRIA proposed scenario A. There were the 2 additional options which showed up in red lines in the figures on the presentation today. Cumulatively, looking out to 2045, those all have this identical number of allowances in them. So the numbers that we're talking, the 265, the 180 million, those relate only to amount less relative to current budgets up through 2030.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now hear from Rich Blostein. Rich, you may unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Yes, thank you very much for this very informative webinar. My name is Rich Blostein. I'm a journalist with Climate Brief of the Continuing Education of the Bar. Just a question about the presentation. It was about planning to inform planning to be in sync to leverage recent federal incentives. Could we perhaps list the key of those federal incentives and how secure are they? Maybe differences between authorization and appropriation. Thank you.
So that's a very detailed question, and we'd have to go back and pull some of those materials together. But we know that in the scoping plan, we identified a very huge increase in renewable hydrogen. And of course, there's the Arches Hub that was awarded to California, and there's the 45B credit for hydrogen. And then when we look at things like carbon capture and sequestration or direct air capture, there's significant federal funding that's available for that. And then ARB has posted on its website its CPRG document, and we are pursuing with sister state agencies grants on transportation, waste diversion, and clean energy, in addition to other grants that are being sought by the CPUC and CEC. So there's been a lot of movement at the federal level in terms of tax credits and just even grants and funding. And so we're trying to figure out across the state agencies which ones we should be pursuing and which ones do we do together, or do we partner with local regions through our air districts or our other local agencies. The key is that those aren't going to be there for a long time. And we're talking about sending a signal for private-public investment to happen sooner than later, so that we can get that private investment into the California priorities, pair it with federal opportunities, and help California achieve its targets for both air quality and greenhouse gases at lower cost to Californians. So that's really why we keep talking about trying to leverage those federal funds. There's a finite time that those are going to be available, and there's a finite opportunity for California to position itself with the private sector and provide certainty so the private sector knows where to put its money. And we want that money put in California to help with our priorities. And that's the issue here. Thank you.
Thank you. Looks like we currently have 3 hands raised, and we will now hear from Ari Freisinger. Ari, you may unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Sorry.
Hi.
I want to thank CARB leadership and staff for the presentation today. Three very quick questions for CARB. The first is there have been some questions suggesting future workshops. So does CARB currently anticipate any further workshops prior to releasing a draft? I didn't see anything in the kind of anticipated schedule. The second, I know the SRIA is not a staff proposal, but there was a section that talked about replenishing the voluntary renewable electricity allowance reserve, which the SRIA had 5.5 million allowances. Just context, is that still being considered, and would that be part of the 180 million adjustment or in addition? And the last one, I'm not sure if Quebec is taking questions or whether CARB can respond to this, but whether Quebec is still considering some of the adjustments that were proposed in the November workshop, some kind of similar context around what CARB has presented today. Thank you.
Thanks, Ari. We'll continue to, where we are now, we're holding this workshop. We'll get feedback from this through July and consider those. If and when we do hold another workshop, we will announce that, as we always do, through the channels of the email service list announcements. So no, I don't have any news on potential new workshops beyond this one right now. Regarding the VRE program, there was discussion of making contributions to that reserve account on the order of a few million allowances. I believe those were considered distinct and separate from the allowance budget removals of allowances that were being discussed today. And so that, we could still take additional information on that in response to this workshop, if you're interested in providing them written comments. Regarding your final question, I'm not sure if we still have Jean-Yves with us. I believe we do. There he is. I'll let him weigh in on the question related to activities in Quebec.
Yes, thank you, Mark. As mentioned in the workshop that we held this summer and this fall, we are still planning to bring some changes to our cap and trade program. We keep working in collaboration with California. Similar to California, we are planning to come up with a draft regulation this fall for an adoption of a rate change early next year. I don't have new details. All the material are available on our website, so you can consult the workshop that we did last fall. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we will hear from Austin Avery. Austin, you may unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Hi, good afternoon, Austin Avery. First, I'd just like to thank CARB staff for hosting this workshop today. And I just have more of a specific question for staff, and maybe I can get some clarity on this. And that is how does CARB staff come up with their cap adjustment factor? In essence, what is the equation for CARB when they come up with the CAF? And then would that be found in the actual cap and trade regulation itself, or is that somewhere else in supporting documentation that CARB has? Thank you.
Thanks, Avery. The cap adjustment factors do show up in a specific table in the regulation. And the simplest way I can say is that they are exactly proportional to the overall allowance budgets. For example, if a allowance budget were 100 million and the cap adjustment factor for that year were 1, and the next year, the allowance budget were 95 million. The cap adjustment factor for that year would be 0.95. So that is the basic, very simplified math for determining the cap adjustment factors. And they do appear, I believe it's table 9-2 in the California cap and trade regulation.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. We will now hear from Ruben Lebowski. Ruben, you may unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Hi, thanks so much. It's Ruben Lebowski at Lombard ODA. Just two questions. One is, has consideration been given as to whether there might be additions to the APCR quantities to correspond to the post-2030 budgets? That's my first question. And second question is on the option 2, could you perhaps shed light on the rationale for having the flat cap trajectory, before the decline, rather than just a more gradually decreasing cap that could still meet the same cumulative total? Thanks.
Thanks for the questions, Ruben. On the second piece there, I think there are some constraints on developing proposals for allowance budgets. These were a couple that we could put forward that would make sense and we felt, facilitate conversation about what would be appropriate. So, these are a couple, potential options among others that could facilitate the needed allowance budgets going forward to meet our goals and would demonstrate a potential range of options. Related to potential contributions to the reserve tiers for cost containment from the post-2030 budgets, I think we would welcome feedback in that area from observers today.
Thank you, Mark. Looks like we have a few more commenters here. Mikhail Skvarla, you may unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. Just thinking about the later implementation date, is there any possibility of potentially being able to, if things start to coalesce around one option or the other, getting the allocations and out and decided early so that we have that extra year, as it may potentially benefit the economics over the next 5 years?
Yeah, so there are options that we've considered, and maybe if folks want to provide some of those in the comments to this workshop, that would be great. I mean, it would be a bit complicated, but we could also consider just allocating the way it is under 2025, but then the caps start adjusting now and then trying to do a true up on allocation later. It's a bit more complicated and convoluted than just trying to have the straight cap declines and then have that tied back to the allocation. But there are options to try and do this. And if folks want to be creative and offer any to us, they can. We've also been thinking about a way to just set the caps even from 26 to 2030, but also make up somehow from, 2025 to 2030, but somehow make up for giving some additional allocation under a different cap adjustment factor.
I appreciate that. I think we'll go back to the membership and try to figure something out. I just think that extra year might be helpful.
Yeah, it does affect the cap decline. We know that. So thanks.
Thank you. We will next hear from Kostin Bontas. Kostin, you may unmute yourself and begin.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for taking my question. I just wanted to highlight sort of as a market practitioner, the dynamic and the tension behind with respect to the timing of supply reduction. The market is obviously forward-looking, and the market will recognize the reduction in the bank of allowances into 2030 and beyond. Nevertheless, I would suggest to you that it is very important to address the supply demand over coming months and years, particularly given the date to the start of the implementation of the program. So I think that option one presents some challenges in that regard, because the toleration over the coming 5 to 6 years is less than perhaps some anticipated, and also it is somewhat backdated because of delayed implementation. So I think anything that can be done to address that would be very helpful. Thank you.
I want to weigh in on this one. Every rulemaking at CARB has a certain process and engagement requirement and steps that we have to do under the Administrative Procedures Act. It's always at least a year, and it always has some preceding informal process. We understand that the market wants certainty sooner than later, but I think what you should be recognizing over the course of the workshops that we've been having, and even the release of the SRIA and the workshop today, we are working towards and refining towards a final position of where staff will probably make a 45-day proposal. And so I understand that a delay in the schedule, having the reg in effect in, August of this month versus maybe January of next month, seems like a huge delay. From a regulatory development process, it's actually not. And I understand that pulling 180 versus 265 million allowances in options 1 and 2 seems like a really big difference, but that entire 180 is being shown as coming from the auction and allocation. That's more than 50% of that 265. So I've seen the articles, I've seen the back and forth and the opinions that have been put out there. And I understand that everybody wants some certainty sooner than later. But the reality is, this is the way regulations are done. And over time, the staff has been refining towards a place that makes the most sense, taking in feedback and trying to understand what different statutes and what different concerns they have to navigate in a final staff proposal. That is the process. That is how we do these programs. And as the market administrator, we understand what that means to the market itself, including the secondary market. And we are doing what we can to show where we're headed, but also recognizing that there is a process here that we have to respect. Thanks.
Thank you, Rajinder. Next, we will hear from Clayton Munnings. Clayton, please unmute yourself and begin your comment.
Hey there. This is, I guess, a comment to CARB, but also to some of the market stakeholders that made comments related to the cap and trade program and local air emissions. I just wanted to explicitly say that I'm only aware of 2 peer-reviewed causal studies that investigate this topic. I think both of those aspects are important: peer-reviewed so that the science is vetted, and then causal rather than correlational. And so those 2 studies are very recent. The first is published in the Journal of Public Economics by Danae Hernandez-Cortez out of Arizona State University, Kyle Meng out of UC Santa Barbara, currently serving at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. They look at the causal impact of the cap and trade program on local air emissions and find substantial reductions caused by the cap and trade program. And then the second study, just coming out in 2024, is by Glenn Sheriff, also at Arizona State University, focused on the causal effect of the program on air toxic releases. And this article is published in the Journal of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. Again, Glenn finds that the cap and trade program caused substantial reductions in air toxic releases. So I'm bringing this up because the 2 peer-reviewed causal studies, in other words, our best available academic evidence, shows that the cap and trade program causes reductions in local air emissions and air toxins. So for those wanting more local air pollution reductions from the program or more toxic reductions from the program, the most obvious and perhaps the best place to start is simply lowering the cap. So option 1 and option 2 do that. And in the context of this rulemaking, option 2 does it more so, but both options lower the cap and are a good and obvious place to start. Thank you.
Thanks, Clayton, and appreciate your flagging those research studies. I can add to that list the Office of Environmental Health and Hazards Assessment Study, OEHA study, from within Cal EPA that has also looked at cap and trade and local emissions related to near stationary sources, and is actually finding larger improvements in air quality in communities near sources versus further away from sources. So with that, I believe we have all of our, there's no more hands raised. So Cypress, I don't know if you want to, if there's any others, let me just check in on that.
Yeah, we have no more hands raised, so I think we're good to wrap up the public comment session for today.
Okay, thank you, and thank you all for the excellent questions and feedback. And leading right in, we have done some program evaluations at the staff level and posted those to our web pages. Specifically, this first link here, I think, is pointing exactly to a couple of the studies that Clayton just noted, in addition to the one that I tried to raise, the OEHA study. We've also taken a look at allowance supply and some recent criticisms to the compliance offset program. Those are all available to you on the Cap and Trade program webpage. And so invite you to click these links, which are in the slides that are also available, and explore that information on the Cap and Trade program webpage. With that, I will note that, again, thank you for the verbal feedback. It is much appreciated. We also are taking written feedback after this workshop. We'll have a comment docket open at the Cap and Trade program meetings and workshop webpage. That'll be there through July 31st, and you can upload written comments there, which we will then be able to take a closer look at and review thoroughly to consider as we develop a proposal going forward. I really appreciate everybody tuning in, and again, for your attention and for the thoughtful feedback and comments and questions. Look forward to receiving your written comments and wish you a good afternoon. Thank you.